This event was inspired by National Interfaith Week, which is this week, but also through learning about the shared friendship that exists between the Jewish community and the Muslim community throughout our history. So, for instance, the Jewish populations, despite being a minority population under the Muslim rule, they were granted rights and high status in the Middle East, and both nations lived peacefully side by side for thousands of years. Hence, those still Jewish populations still can be found living in countries such as Iran or Yemen, whose families have been there for like 2,000 years. Additionally, there were cases of hundreds of Muslim families living in Albania and Bosnia who helped shelter Jewish families during the World War II Holocaust. And likewise, the Jewish community leaders in Bosnia helped in the 1990s Bosnian War, and they converted the synagogue into an aid distribution centre and help move the safe passage of Muslims and Christians and Jews from the city in Bosnia away from the war. So, inshallah, we want to renew this friendship again in the 21st century by this really local student effort, and to make clear that despite all the media pressures, that where there's a culture of Islamophobia and anti-Semitism today, that Muslims and Jews will work hard to making strong friendship between ourselves to last another few millennia. So, before I introduce the first speaker, I just want to introduce the BRISOC committee. Can Noah sign up? He's our president.
All right, everybody. Nice to meet you. Thank you for coming. I'm the vice president.
And then there's Khadija, our vice president. Then there's Saha Hassan, our external affairs. And then this one, our IT officer, and Yusra, our assistant rep. So, if anyone wants to do anything?
Okay, so unfortunately we couldn't get Squad Assembly up here because our AGM was last Monday. But in any case, I'm here. I'm Raphael, the Interfaith Officer for the Jewish Society. And if you want to be part of the committee, we'll be holding our events tomorrow, the Jummah Fairs, where we'll be attending, as well as a Kalat Shabbat, where you'll be able to meet us all together.
Cool. So,
you'll get a personal meeting from us all.
So, just to introduce Matt Berry. He is visiting us from Cardiff University today. He's an established lecturer at Cardiff Uni in the School of Journalism, Media and Cultural Studies. He completed his BSc at Bath Uni, worked as a media researcher at the University of California, before returning back to the UK to complete his PhD at the University of Glasgow, where he worked alongside a prestigious Glasgow media group, who are famous for their contribution to the understanding of media and TV news. They're also personally endorsed by a number of people. So without further ado,
Okay, no problem. Thank you very much for inviting me down here. It's very nice to be down here in Bristol. You'll have to forgive me today for a couple of things. First of all, almost completely deaf on one side of my head at the moment. My ears closed up last week, so I'm feeling slightly disorientated today. So I'm not completely clear on my voice sounds strange, so you'll have to forgive me. The second thing I was going to say is, this is not really my kind of central area of expertise in terms of representation of various different faith or minority groups in the media. At the moment, my kind of interest is really looking at media reporting of finance and the economy. But I have a number of colleagues who work in this area, and I do know something of the literature. I'm going to talk a little bit today about some research that's been done at both Cardiff University and some recent research that's been done at Glasgow University. Some of us have been looking at representation of Muslims and representation of Islam in the media, and others have been more generally looking at issues around migration, immigration, and asylum seekers. Okay. So I'll hopefully probably not keep you more than sort of 10 or 15 minutes, just give you a little bit of background or a flavour of some of the research that's been done recently at Cardiff and at Nottingham. Okay. Now, some of my colleagues at Cardiff in 2008 did a piece of research looking at images of Islam. But what they found when they plotted how Islam appeared and the frequency about stories about Islam appearing in the British press over a period of time, we saw a very, very large spike after 2004. Now, it's not immediately obvious why you had this spike. But then interestingly enough, after the attacks of September 11th, when we actually look at the kind of hooks for stories relating to Muslims, Islam in Britain, we find that there's a very, very strong concentration on a number of key kind of negative themes. As you can see, themes such as terrorism, religious cultural issues related to issues like the veil, Muslim extremism, social unrest and community relations, and perhaps slightly or considerably less attention focused on some of the problems that Muslims themselves face, such as issues around Islamophobia and violence and attacks. So what you see when you look at a kind of big picture of the reporting of issues relating to Islam and British Muslims is a very, very strong focus on very, very negative issues around British Muslims, particularly focusing on issues around terrorism and extremism. And what you also see, which is quite interesting, is how these books change over time. So the issue of religious cultural issues, you might think of these as say related to kind of questions about things like prayer. Those have been on a very, very much upward trajectory since 2002. Terrorism, stories related to terrorism kind of spiked around 2002. I don't know exactly why that would be, but there was certainly a lot of government kind of briefings around that time stressing the dangers of terrorism. This was, of course, in the period leading up to the Iraq War. And that has kind of come down a little bit, but it still remains a very big news hook for stories about British Muslims. And you can see that at the bottom, the orange, that stories related to kind of violence and attacks against Muslims still kind of stays at a relatively low level. Now it's particularly, or it has been particularly low level, sort of from 2006 to 2008. So when we actually see stories, and this is what one of our colleagues did, looked at the percentage of stories comparing Islam to other religions, what you find is that overwhelmingly Islam tends to be presented in a very, very negative context. Okay? And this is particularly so in the tabloid press. Okay? Also, the broadsheet press, you get this kind of emphasis a lot. Very little favourable coverage in these broadsheets, all the tabloid press. There's certainly a great deal, I'm sure I can tell you this already, a great deal of very, very unfavourable coverage, particularly in the tabloid press. And as I say, here's a breakdown of the most prominent ideas associated with British Muslims, threat of terrorism, Islam is dangerous, backward or irrational, Islam in relation to multiculturalism, the kind of Samuel Huntington thesis about the clash of civilization between Islam and the West, and about 9% Islam looks a threat to the way of life. So by far the most common kind of representations or links to Islam that we found made during this period of time, around sort of between 2000 and 2008, was focusing on very, very negative representation of Islam and Muslims in the British press. And here's some breakdown of some of the data relating to the kind of language that was used. So things like terrorists are used in about a fifth of stories when we're talking about British Muslims, extremist Islamists, suicide bombers, as you see, adjectives, often very pejorative adjectives such as radical, fanatical, fundamentalist, or extremist. So, generally speaking, and as I say, I'm sure I don't have to kind of go into this in great deal of detail, but I've kind of presented the data for you here. The representation of Muslims, particularly in the British press, tends to be very, very negative. Okay? And obviously, there are certain kinds of bête noirs, such as Abu Hamza, who get a great deal of coverage. Okay? Found quite literally hundreds of stories. Our colleagues found that they were actually looking in detail at newspaper reporting. There were, Abu Hamza was in almost every week in some periods of time. We now want to look in detail at a couple of case studies at reporting in this area. Okay? So much of the coverage, as I said, I've talked about already, tended to present Muslims as a threat to Britain. We focused upon differences in culture, and values between Muslims in Britain and mainstream British culture. Okay? What mainstream British culture wasn't usually clearly defined, or it was very, very rarely defined. It was often just presumed that we knew what mainstream British culture was. What was important was to highlight the difference between mainstream British culture and what Muslims were seen to represent. Okay? So in this, it's often presented as incompatible Islam threatening to the culture. Okay? In light of this, signs of the presence of Islam in the UK on the one hand and the visible customs and cultural practices of Muslims on the other are often represented as problematic, as deliberately antagonistic or provocative to mainstream British culture. Okay? I think an interesting example of this was a story which was triggered by comments from the Bishop of Rochester, Michael Nazir, on the 6th of January 2008, when he said in a Sunday Times interview that he warned of attempts to impose an Islamic character on certain areas. What you often find in the media is when a particular spokesman, a particular high status person makes a statement, this will often get picked up by other parts of the media and then will then run with it, and it will become a very, very big story. And this is what happened with the comments by the Bishop of Rochester. So he pointed to things such as the introduction of the Muslim call to prayer, and what he described as pressure already to relate aspects of the Sharia to civil law in Britain. And he talked about what were described as no-go areas. What we found was that between the 3rd and the 17th of January, the immediate period after he made these statements, there were about 40 articles appeared across the broadsheet and tabloid press discussing his comments. Okay? And these highlighted his claims that there were no-go areas for non-Muslims in Britain, which had developed, and that what you saw afterwards was that various national politicians, Muslim spokesmen, and various clergy kind of jumped in to the whole debate around this kind of issue of whether there really were no-go areas. If we look at some of the coverage, what you tended to find was that most of the right-wing press jumped in immediately and made very, very kind of strong statements backing up what the Bishop of Rochester was saying. Okay? Some of it was obviously quite inflammatory, the kind of language that was being used at this time by the press. And they tended to highlight two particular messages: the issue of self-segregation and the issue of what was described as the Islamification of Britain. A kind of colonisation from within. You also got a critical response from certain sections of the political class, so politicians such as William Kay, Nick Clegg and Gordon Brown also jumped in to the debate, and that was actually quite supportive of what the Bishop was actually saying. Gordon Brown, interestingly, said, "I know that there are pressures in many areas of the country, but I don't accept that there are or should be no-go areas in parts of the country." So the Prime Minister at that time kind of stepped in, and he didn't actually condemn in any sense what the Bishop said, and he kind of, in some senses, he gave the story a degree of legs, he gave it a bit more traction by actually kind of saying, well, you know, there shouldn't actually be no-go areas. But of course, there's a big debate about whether these no-go areas actually existed, certainly for the police. You did also find that the kind of imagery that was used in this was quite problematic. So this was one of the images that was used repeatedly. This was with the headline, "See, no-go areas exist there, Mr. Brown," in the Express on the 12th of January. And this photograph of the three women in traditional dress looking defiantly into the camera lens, so it's obviously quite problematic for a number of reasons. The figure on the right obscures her eyes from the gaze of the audience, the figure in the centre pushing up brown stairs forthrightly straight ahead, and the figure on the left is pictured with her hand raised in an insulting two-fingered gesture. Okay? And this kind of image, I think, tends to reinforce the idea of Muslim rejection of British mainstream culture. It was used in several, as I say, in several news stories to illustrate the no-go areas the story. And certainly I think there's an argument that it facilitated an important slippage of meaning. That religious and cultural difference cultivated in no-go areas has led to a frightening Muslim hostility towards non-Muslims. And such no-go areas could be frightening just because of their religious and cultural otherness, okay? but also by the gestures and looks of the traditionally dressed women. Okay? The picture seemed to suggest perhaps Muslims harbour more than aggressive and perhaps a more extreme or radical element. And there are perhaps too, I might suggest, other presuppositions and stereotypes at play. The fact that it is women represented, I think, is significant. I think it renders the image even more worrying. It's not just a fringe element of young, radicalised men who pose a threat to Britain, but it's also Muslim community more generally, including those who will nurture the next generation. And as I would suggest, this is a very, very problematic kind of image that was used. And this was another comment from the Daily Express at the time. And I think in terms of all the kind of papers that present problematic representations of Muslims, but also more broadly of asylum seekers and immigrants generally, I think the Express is probably the most problematic, even more problematic than the Daily Mail. Okay, so, for too long, our ruling elite has been in denial about the consequences of this insidious process, pretending that the assertiveness of Muslim culture is just another element of the English society of Britain. Okay? In some senses, there are kind of almost throwbacks to kind of some of the sort of Enoch Powell speeches from the 1970s and some of the discourses that we found looking at kind of representation in tabloid press here. We'll move on to, this is just to also say that there were also a few examples of people actually challenging what the Bishop of Rochester said. Okay? Even in the Times and the Telegraph, you did actually get some criticism. But the quantity of criticism of these kind of comments that the Bishop of Rochester said were actually relatively small compared to the large volume of coverage, particularly in the tabloid press, which kind of took these comments and ran with them. I want to look at also a second case study of how sometimes Muslims are represented, a kind of more in-depth study as compared to some of the quantitative data that came on. But this is a comment that was made by Dr. Abdul Barry. Okay? He was interviewed in the Telegraph in November 2007. He said, every society has to be really careful so the situation doesn't lead us to a time when people's minds can be poisoned as they were in the 1930s. If your community is perceived in a very negative manner, and poll after poll that says we're alienated, then Muslim community feel vulnerable. And I think it's fairly clear here that what Dr. Barry was trying to say was that some of the reporting in the media was very, very inflammatory. It was likely to lead to prejudice against Muslims in certain parts of the community. But this was not how it was reported in the papers. In fact, the papers had a bit of a field day with this. Right? So furious Muslim brands Britain Nazi. I mean, there was nobody look at it again. There's no mention of the word Nazi. Okay? And he was talking probably more relating to kind of the rise of the black shirts in the 1930s and British fascism. He wasn't actually talking specifically about the Nazis. And obviously there was a point to be made that the Daily Mail was actually produced a lot of a number of editorials at the time during the 1930s actually supportive of National Socialism and the Nazis, which made some of the coverage quite ironic in some senses. Okay, you had the Daily Telegraph. Comparisons to Nazi Germany inaccurately reflect Muslim status in Britain, and Muslim in fear of Nazi UK. As you said, Dr. Barry didn't even mention at any point the word Nazi. Okay? And these are some of the other coverage that you saw. How dare the head of the Muslim Council compare Britain to Nazi Germany after 305,000 of our soldiers died fighting the Nazis. Okay? So even trying to have a kind of rational discussion about the fact that some of the inflammatory, it's very problematic, and is likely to inflame tension and also prejudice, leads to this kind of degree of, or can lead to this kind of degree of mangling of what the person actually said in this representation, which I think is very, very problematic. And this was probably the strongest statement that was made after Barry, and of course the Sunday Express. I'm sure the comments made by Mr. Barry, the head of the Muslim Council, but it must constitute some form of offence for which you could be arrested. I mean, let's go back and look at that statement again and ask whether you think if you should actually be arrested for making statements like this, because it's a very wild statement to suggest that somebody should be arrested for just making a relatively innocuous statement that probably most Muslims would wholeheartedly endorse. So, talked a little bit there about the representation of Muslims. I wanted to talk for kind of the last 5 minutes about some research that was done by some former colleagues of mine on the representation of refugees. This research looked at what we sometimes call the circuit of communication. So it looked at the nature of how media messages were produced, what pressures the journalists would work under, what were the pressures that came in from political parties, lobby groups, how did editorial particular guidelines work at newspapers, what were the constraints that journalists operated on one hand. So on one hand they were interested in the nature of how media messages were produced, but they were also interested in looking at the content of messages, so actually analysing, as we just looked at a minute ago, the nature of some of the kind of media accounts. They were also interested very much in what impact these kind of media messages or these kind of particularly negative representations had on public opinion. What they found when they looked at it, particularly in relation to issues relating to refugees and migration and asylum, was that in particularly most of the right-wing press, there was a huge confusion between issues of immigration and issues of asylum and people feeling persecution as refugees. And these particular confusions and this conflating of these two issues was done deliberately and happened all the time in the right-wing press. And you also found in interviews with journalists, a lot of journalists actually felt very uncomfortable about the stories that they were asked to write by their editors. Right? This is what one of the Star journalists said: there's nothing better than a Muslim asylum seeker. That's sort of the jackpot, I suppose. Any social ills can be traced to immigrants and asylum seekers flooding into the country. In some sense, we might expect that from a journalist at the Daily Star. What we might not expect was what some of my colleagues were told by the source inside one of the broadsheets, that young, inexperienced reporters will be pressurised to put their conscience aside and go out and monster the asylum seeker. And that's what some journalists were told. And if you're a journalist working for a paper, you don't actually have that much ability to actually kick back about what you're actually told to do by your editor and your immediate people above you in the layers of management. It's deeply problematic. And when we asked, when my colleagues asked ordinary members of the public in focus groups to actually reproduce or to write out newspaper headlines that they thought they might see, they were given photographs sometimes, and they were asked to reproduce kind of headlines that you might see in the papers. These are the kind of headlines that they came up with. Migrants have been covered, Britain getting flooded, Britain being invaded, free homes, crime rate increases, asylum. And interestingly, I did quite a bit of research looking at public understanding of the banking crisis. And one of the things that really shocked me that I wasn't expecting was I said to people, where's the budget deficit come from? How come we owe so much money? One of the things that came across repeatedly to me was the perception that the immigrants and the asylum seekers had taken all the money, and that's why we were in such a lot of problem. It's completely economically illiterate. So many people believe this. And I said to people, why do you believe this? Why on earth do you think that I don't know why on earth you have to stay kind of neutral research. But I said, what makes you think that this is related see in the papers, you know, all the people who are coming in, they've got 10 passports, they're all on the fiddle. And these messages that are repeated again and again and again in the tabloid press about asylum seekers, often Muslims asylum seekers, it's a defraud the benefit system and they're getting free, I was told repeatedly that people are getting free cars, free driving lessons, and it's all luxury for them while the rest of us have to kind of scrape by. These things have a really deep impact on public knowledge, public understanding, and public hostility. And when my colleagues spoke to refugees, but also people within migrant and immigrant communities, maybe second or third generation migrants, what they found was that these kinds of media headlines, that were kind of particularly kind of tabloid coverage, had an incredibly negative impact on them. People felt fear, anxiety, depression. A lot of people, they said, actually contemplated suicide. I think the key thing to realise is this is not just the particular asylum seekers and recent migrants. Second generation people who were born here, who were Asians and who were black, felt in fear of the police, and some of them carried their passports around with them because this negative coverage, although it was only supposed to be covering asylum seekers, they felt that it meant the police, and it also meant ordinary members of the public would assume that they were also here illegally, even though some of those people have been here for generations and been born here. So it had a wider, not just on the people who were refugees, who were asylum seekers, it had a wider impact, a very, very negative impact on the life and the experiences of long-settled migrant communities in Britain. So I just want to finish up by saying, of course it's partly the fault of the press, but there's also been a great deal of connivance in this with politicians themselves. I think one of the interesting examples that one of my colleagues highlighted was in 2008, the Labour government actually sponsored Sky Border Patrol programme on television in order to try and present the image that it was getting tough on immigration. Okay, so there's a collusion in a lot of this, as much as we can be critical of the media, there is a collusion and close relationship often with the political class, something that's very, very negative. Okay, I think I've probably spoken for quite long enough, and I'll pass on to whoever else is coming next.
Until previously, he was the chair of Radio Shalom, an organisation based in Bristol that works to build bridges between the Muslim and Jewish communities, and which still continues projects with particularly the young to this day. We have even a couple of other representatives in the audience tonight. Tonight, he's going to be giving a particular talk, a short talk, on the essential concept of how the media handles the concept of representing a community and whether or not there are issues inherent in blackness. So I'd like to please welcome Lisa Bill.
I'm not going to give you slides, I'm not going to give you stats, and I want to take this from a slightly different perspective, but thank you, Mike. There's some stuff that really resonates with a lot of the work that I do in the media, a lot of the work that I've done in the past with the media, and a lot of the things that I've experienced. I want to just ask a question. How many of you would classify yourself, deem yourselves to be Muslim? Hands in the air. Okay. How many would deem yourselves Jewish? Okay. How many of you would say that you came or come from the same community? Two of you. Okay, you don't understand the question. No, okay. I've quite deliberately phrased it that way, and there's a reason for that. And actually what Mike has just shown you is an absolute explanation of what I'm trying to say. the media talk about Muslims in the same way as the media talk about Jews, as if you're a homogenous group of people. But actually you aren't. You as Muslims are not homogenous any more than we as Jews are homogenous. We're not one community. There is no one Jewish community. There's no one Muslim community. You share culture, you share belief, you share faith if that's your bag. But actually, there's no one community. Part of the problem that I think as individuals we face, and as people who have faith, if you have faith, as people who come from a cultural background, whatever it may be, as Jews or Muslims, one of the things that we face is that we're constantly being homogenized, that we're constantly being pigeonholed into one box. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, because I'm going to ask some more views from you. But what is community? How does community exist? And how someone get out, how do you define community? Anyone? Tradition? Space. So physical, geographical space. Yeah. How else? Say again? Common interests? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, members of BRISOC have a kind of common interest. Doesn't necessarily mean you agree on everything, but you have a kind of common interest. Okay, so community can mean a range of things to a range of people. I mean, some of you, I don't know if any of you read the Bristol Post. I write an occasional column in the Bristol Post. The last one I wrote, I was headlined as spokesman for the Jewish community. Whoa, that's some responsibility. There's an awful lot of us, not in Bristol, but there's an awful lot of Jews in the UK. And all of a sudden, I'm the spokesman for the Jewish community, whatever that may be. Okay? And it's very easy, as Mike's shown you, for a word, a name, a label to be applied. And all of a sudden, you become the community, the spokesman for the community. And that's actually a very big responsibility. And more importantly, the reality is, I'm not. Any more than anybody else. The chief rabbi is not the spokesperson for the Jewish community. The chief rabbi is the head rabbi of a particular group of Jews. Okay? He doesn't speak for me, believe me. And certainly the outgoing rabbi, Jonathan Sachs, certainly didn't speak for me as a Jew. I don't stand up and go, yeah, what he said. He's down with the Jews. Not as far as I'm concerned. And I'm sure that in many ways there are people that you have as spokespeople for the Muslim community, or spokespeople for the student community, or spokespeople for your so-called community, that ain't actually spokespeople. And yet they very often are the people that the media will talk to. It's the squeaky wheel rule, The squeaky wheel is the one that gets oiled. It's the people that shout the loudest that often get heard. In the same way as the media will always go to the most controversial people, because they're the ones that can make the news. They're the ones that can stir up the stories. They're the ones that are always heard. Ready to quote. There's always people that you will hear as regular spokespeople for the Muslim community or the Jewish community. Not necessarily in my name or your name, but they're very good with the media, because they're the ones that will say either what the media want to hear, as Mike's pointed out, or they'll say it in a way that's controversial enough to give the media a story. Who's the media? Actually, to get down to brass tacks, who's the media? What's the media? Come on, this is not a one-way, this is not a rhetorical question. Who's the media? Journalists? Okay, what's a journalist? How do you define a journalist? Somebody that gets paid to write content for a media product. Okay, that's a definition. Sorry? Say it again.
That's a circular definition.
Doesn't matter whether it's circular or not, it's a definition, but I understand what you're saying. It could be a circular definition. How else would you define the media? Who's a journalist? Okay, print press, okay, fine. What about the internet? Social media. Is that the media? Does that count? Yes? You think it does? Okay, why do you think it counts as the media? I'm not picking on it, it's fine. You know, this is a conversation. Why do you think it's the media?
Because loads of people share the views online, and then there's certain people that when they express the view, young people tend to go for the view, maybe because they're really popular.
Okay, so for those that weren't able to hear that, a lot of people share their views on social media, and there are some people who are listed to more popular. So bloggers, for example, there are some bloggers. Huffington Post, for example, has now become conventional institutional media. Huffington Post started off as a blog, and now look at where it is now. It's almost mainstream. Okay, so do you define social media as media? Maybe. Are bloggers journalists? How many people think bloggers are journalists? To an extent. Few of you. How many don't? How many don't see bloggers as journalists? Okay, let me tell you something. Some of the world's leading bloggers have more influence than any newspaper or any television outlet in the world. There are some bloggers who have millions, and I mean millions, of followers. People who read them daily. People who have bigger circulation globally than any newspaper in the world. Does that make them a journalist? Does that make them media? I would say. Does it make them good journalists? Define good. There are a lot of blogs that talk about Islamophobic issues, they talk about Islam, they talk about Judaism, they talk about anti-Semitism. They have big followers, big numbers of followers. To make them good journalists, define good. It's what you believe, what you read, and whether you want to hear it. The message that they produce is the one that might resonate with you. Okay? Media is a very big term, in the same way as community is a very big term. Very big term. I was talking to Mike just before we started, and I think he and I share the view that there's a difference between citizen journalists, the people that go around and you have a smartphone in your hand, something happens, you report it, it goes out on Twitter, all of a sudden it's viral. And there's nothing wrong with that. And most of the mainstream media will use the BBC as a study. Most of the mainstream media are dependent on a lot of that now because there are only a limited number of, as you would call, professional journalists who are able to cover the massive amount of news that's going on. In some cases, professional journalists can't get anywhere near the areas that news is happening. Professional journalists couldn't get in to cover the war that went on in Iran. They can't get into Afghanistan to cover what's actually going on. The people that reported what was going on in Iraq when the bombs were going off were actually the best and most read were actually those that were blogging from inside. Why? Because they were on the spot and they had the technology to be able to do it. The most famous one, and I've forgotten his name, was a dentist. I've forgotten his name. He ended up writing in the Guardian. He was given a name. If anyone can remember, please yell it out. I can't remember his name. But he became the lead writer for what was going on during the Gulf conflict. He was a dentist. He was sitting in his loft in Baghdad with a smartphone blogging.
Salam Pax.
Thank you, Salam Pax. Very good. That's why he's in media, actually. He was a dentist. He became a very well-known journalist. He became a reporter. So this concept of media, of a sort of homogenous media, has actually changed dramatically in the last 10 years, certainly in the last 5 years, but without question in the last 10 years. I just want to touch on a couple of other quick things before we open this up to the floor. I'm not going to get into the whole paranoia of Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, because I think it's very easy to do that. It was quite interesting. I wrote, not the last article I wrote, which was a couple of days ago, but the previous article a couple of weeks ago in the Bristol Post. I covered the story about the Yid debate. Anyone up with this? The Yid debate? Okay, I see the Jewish members of the audience going, yeah, we know what you're talking about. It's interesting. There's a big deal about chanting on terraces at Spurs. Okay? Any of you into football? Yeah, most of you know what I'm talking about. They call themselves the Yids. How many of you are aware that Yid is a derogatory term for a Jew? Okay, quite a lot of you don't. Okay, interesting. It's a term, I won't go into the history of it. If you want to read about it, go onto my blog, do some research, go onto the thing in Bristol Post, go and do some research about it, look up the thing about Spurs and Yids. The reality is that a lot of this now has become a big deal, because actually it's chanted on the terraces, the FA have banned it, it's racist. At least as defined by most people. Interestingly, Spurs supporters, and there is a degree of history about Spurs because it was in the heart of a Jewish part of East London, they become proud to be known as the Yids. It was used against them, now they've turned it and used it as a badge of honour. They chant the Yids. And who are the people that are actually leading the pride on this? It's actually the Jewish supporters within Spurs. Okay, so they now claim to be proud to use a derogatory term, like niggers, like the term nigger being used by Afro-Caribbean communities in the UK and America. Okay? Bit of a story. I don't normally get comments on my blogs. I don't on my thing in Bristol Post. Most people don't bother to read them, and I can understand why then. This one got a lot of comments. Now, it either says that the statement that football is not just a game, it's a religion, actually does mean something, and it is true, or actually it did spark something with a number of people and resonate, because I got quite a lot of comments about it. One of them from a Spurs supporter in Essex who said, I'm Jewish, I'm proud of it, and by the way, I'm really proud of what us using the term Yid has done in a positive way. I'm still yet to have that debate with him. I don't understand how generating a racist term and bringing it to the forefront of debate in what they believe is a positive way can actually be a good thing. But let's leave that for another time. But definitions are important. Definitions are vital, and Mike raised this thing about definitions. What's the definition of a Muslim? What's the definition of a Jew? What terms are you using to define those people? There are no right answers here, I'm just sowing the seeds of questions. The other thing that Mike raised is this conflation of ideas. The fact that things get meshed together. And one of the things that happens a great deal in the discussion about Judaism, and particularly about anti-Semitism, is the conflation between Jews and Israel. The debate between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. And they are two very different things, and yet they become easily conflated. The number of times that I have been said, you're a Jew, therefore you must support everything that goes on in Israel. Really? Why? Well, because Jews equal Israel, and Israel equals Jews, and therefore everything that we read in the media about Jews is about Israel. Well, no, actually it isn't. They're two different things. They are related, but they're not the same. And there is a massive conflation in people's perceptions. There is a massive conflation very often in the media where these two things get brought together. In the same way as Muslims and immigrants, that conflation of Muslims and immigrants, it's a similar thing. Boy, it must really piss you off, because it really pisses me off. I'll tell you. The number of times that I've got into debates about anti-Semitism and people go, yeah, but you Israelis are all the same. No, hold on a second. I'm not Israeli, I'm Jewish. It's not the same thing. Let's get our definitions right. It's very easy for the media to just meld definitions when it suits. And it needs to be challenged, and it's difficult to challenge, because perceptions and reality are two different things. And that leads to one final thing, one final point that I'll make, which is that one of the comments that was made in the article that I wrote about the YIG debate, which I think is a very fair comment, is you shouldn't be looking, it's good to combat racism where it exists, but you shouldn't be looking over your shoulder and in every corner to find racism where it doesn't. Now, I subscribe to that. I'm not paranoid. I've got friends who think that scratch under the surface and you'll find a anti-Semite, an Islamophobe, or whatever they may be. I don't work that way. I don't believe that. I actually take people on face value, and then if they show themselves to be whatever they are, then you deal with it. I don't go around looking for it. But equally, if you look at what's going on politically at the moment, you look at what's going on in France with the National Front, and then now linking with Holland, you look at what's going on in Hungary, you look at what's going on in Greece, you look at what's going on here in the UK with certain parties, not naming any names UK. Oh, did that come out? You look at what's going on around the politics of Europe, and it's very interesting, the comment that caused the Nazi headlines. If you just start to equate some of the commentary, some of the dialogue, some of the narrative that's going on, not just in the media, but in politics, around Europe at the moment, and you look carefully, and I go back to the thesis that I wrote when I studied politics, whatever it was, 30 years ago, about what was then contemporary British fascism with the National Front, and some of the stuff that was going on then. And then you equate it back to what was going on in Europe, in Germany, in Austria, in all of those areas, back in the 30s. There are certain similarities. There's similarities of economy, there's similarities of socio-economic similarities, and I'm not looking for it. And I'm not saying it's going to happen. And I'm not saying we're on the verge of a new Holocaust. But what I am saying is that it is worth just being vigilant. It's worth watching what's going on. It's worth being aware, and it's worth, where it exists, looking to stand up against Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, and all the issues that might raise about conflation of ideas. Citizen journalists do exist. They do have power. They can have effect. And we as professional journalists also have a moral, I believe, a moral obligation to ensure that we present the facts rather than the conflation of fiction. That's what I have to say.
What's noticeable about how some groups are represented is that you've got concentration on certain individuals. You've got stereotyping. We know that stereotyping has very, very negative impacts on how people think. People have a tendency to fall into in-groups and out-groups, okay? And you tend to denigrate out-groups, and you tend to glorify your own in-group. These are natural human processes that all humans do. We know from all the research in social psychology. See, what I'm talking about here is a stereotyping, association of one group with a particular. So you're not getting the Muslim community, the Jewish community, if there is such a thing, we could use those sort of terms, are a broad, disparate collection of different kinds of people. They may share certain kinds of characteristics in a broad sense of certain groups, but it's made up of individuals. The problem with the media is you don't see people as individuals. You're presented as with people as a homogenised mass. You tend to be represented in a very, very negative way. I think Peter made some really important points. I mean, our whole family is Greek, and one of our family is still over in Greece. And he's what's happening in places like Greece, and you mentioned obviously places in Hungary with the rise of Jobbik and parts like that, is very, very frightening. These things arise out of economic insecurity over time, or at least economic insecurity creates space for these ideas to take root. And I think particularly, after we see all the austerity policies in Europe, we are seeing a growth of that, and it's the homogenisation, and it's the overwhelming negative portrayal of certain groups, which I think is really, really problematic. I mean, there are lots of different portrayals of white people. I mean, back in the 1970s, black people complained because overwhelmingly they were represented in popular cultural forms and also in newspaper forms as being criminals. And representations matter. And it's the narrow range of representation that is really significant.
I think I would add to that images, they say a picture paints 1,000 words, and the reality is that an image is very, very powerful. The other thing is that, and I'm not saying that image was manipulated, but technology now, there's no such thing. They say the camera never lies. They used to say the camera never lies. Not true anymore. It isn't true, because you can manipulate images in ways that you never could previously. But what an image like that does, and what any image does, is it can allow you to highlight what's really different. And when you're talking about social stereotyping, it's difference that matters. So there you have something that is so incongruous. You have 3 women in a very particular style of dress that represents a very particular culture and faith. And one of them was actually doing something that would, in theory, be so incongruous to that culture. And it was a perfect picture. I mean, it's the kind of picture that actually, in a funny way, would be the kind of thing that would work in National Geographic. It's so powerful. But it's because of its difference. And the media will always use difference. Because it's the natural way of portraying stereotypes. How do you portray a Jew? It's harder. Because culturally, or in terms of dress, generally the majority of Jews do not wear any kind of identifying features that make them different, unless you happen to be ultra-Orthodox. So where the power of the image is generally with Jews, the Jewish community, is, I'm going to be slightly derogatory, what I would call the midnight cowboys. Big black hats, ringlets, long coats, all of that. And the ones that make the really powerful images when, for example, images are shown about Israel, is the Hasidic Jews, the ultra-religious Jews, throwing stones, firing weapons, because it's different, because it's incongruous with the perception of that faith, that culture, and the reality of what's being shown. Images are very, very powerful. Does that help? Does that answer your question? Okay. Who else? One there and one there.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so with regards to talking about the media's internal ideas, do you feel that the media has become more self-aware of its limitations? And also, do you think that there's a positive or negative trend?
There's difference to talk about the media, because I think as Peter's trying to highlight, there's so many different aspects of the media. The print media, different sections of the print
Sort of
media.
mainstream.
I mean, even the mainstream media, you have some newspapers which are pretty editorial control. I mean, obviously there's a group of Murdoch's papers used to fall under that now, probably not so much nowadays, but he'd appoint the editors, set the editorial line. But you have other papers, such as The Guardian, for instance, which is owned by a trust. Its editor has a lot more freedom. You have the BBC, which works within a whole series of different regulatory constraints, pressures from public relations, pressures from politicians. So, there's all kinds of complex pressures, and you need to think, rather than just thinking about the media as a monolithic entity, you need to break it down and think of the complicated relationship in which each part of the media operates and the various constraints that it operates under. I don't think the media, you have to kind of talk about one particular media. One area that I would slightly disagree with Peter is, I agree that social media is becoming increasingly important, but at the same time, when you look at most of the research, interestingly enough, legacy media, newspapers, whether they're the print version or the online versions of television, is still immensely important. And also, a lot of the stuff you get in social media is often parasitic of the old print media, where they're often discussing something. And I think what happens usually often if somebody's, as you say, as you do example with the Baghdad blogger, was if somebody's really successful in the blogosphere, they get picked up by the mainstream media and they'll be given a pay. So there's a complex, and you saw this particularly in things such as the Arab revolts in 2011. There's a complex relationship between kind of the old legacy media and the new media. They interact, they feed off each other. Al Jazeera relied very, very heavily on a lot of the material that it got from citizen journalists and people on the ground, and increasingly journalists are using Twitter and social networking in order to research those stories. So I think it's a complicated thing. There's lots of different parts of the media, and they all interact in very, very complex ways that are probably not fully understood yet.
I would totally agree with that, and I think that the media generally is self-aware in terms of who its audience is and who it's appealing to. I mean, we know that the Daily Mail's audience is different from the Guardian's audience. We know that Al Jazeera's audience is going to be different from the audience of Radio 4, for example. I think they are self-aware in terms of who their audience is. I think in the UK they've probably been made somewhat more self-aware of their, I want to say morality. I'm not sure if I believe that, but I think that the latest inquiry, the phone hacking and everything that went around that, and the inquiry as a result of that has perhaps made them, if not more aware, perhaps a little more careful about the way that they practice, that journalists practice their trade, their profession. Does it influence what they say only in terms of how they write the stories? I'm not sure whether is your question, have they become more moralistic? Have they become less extreme?
In a sense of, I suppose, even moralistic, or potentially more aware of the detail they ought to listen to.
We were talking about this as well earlier on about as you described, the mainstream media and how much they cover. I mean, we were talking about finance and health, and the reality is that the majority of correspondence on the mainstream media, so health correspondence, financial correspondence, there actually are a very limited number who really understand the subject that they're talking about in depth. The trade media do, because they have to, they're talking to the trade, but I would suggest that a large number of correspondents, the supposed experts, have a good but not technically in-depth understanding. So does that make them good? Don't know. The thing is, I suppose you have to be careful what you read. That would be my view. Just one thing I'd add to the stats. I totally agree. I agree with you on social media, but there was some research done by Edelman, by the big PR agency in the US a couple of years ago, which asked journalists how do they use social media for standing up stories. Do you know what I mean by standing up a story? Okay, so standing up a story is how you verify. When you generally, as a professional journalist, if you're given a story, you will normally go and stand it up. You'll go and find ways of verifying the truth of the veracity of the story. where the sources were, whether it's true, whether it has actual scientific or there's evidence of it or not. Interestingly, the research that Abelman did, it was a couple of years ago, so I'm sure this statistic will probably increase. 35% of journalists said that they went to social media as their first point of call to stand up a story. Generally, they'd go to Twitter, because if the story was trending on Twitter, they have a pretty good idea that this story was a runner. Now, that's fine, except, you know, as Churchill once said, lies halfway around the world before truth has got its trousers on. So actually, you know, it doesn't necessarily mean it's true because it's trending on Twitter, but interestingly, 35% of journalists are standing up stories by going online and searching social media before they actually went to their traditional sources. So interesting. You wanted to ask a question?
We support that journalists and media is there to cover events and public problems. So why journalists now shifting towards these topics you raised, and what agenda they say if they are unprofessional in their coverage?
I mean, it depends which journalist you're talking about. You know, if you're a journalist on the Star or the Sun, you do what you're ready to tell these people. You know, you don't really have a lot of autonomy. You know, if you step out of line and you produce stories against the person, the stories are going to get spiked. You have to, if you're going to progress, fall in line with the editorial line if you're on a newspaper. There isn't much space for journalist autonomy. I mean, we probably all grew up watching, you know, All the President's Men, and we had Sidney Bernstein, one of the Watergate, one of the guys who brought the Watergate story, coming down, grown up with this ideas of these, you know, guys who are going out there campaigning for truth. And don't get me wrong, a lot of journalists do that. There are areas where journalists have the space to do that. But in a lot of papers, you're constrained in terms of what you can do with the range of stories that you're actually able to portray. So, a lot of the time, I hate to have to say this, a lot of journalists are just rewriting press releases. You know, PR accounts for enormous amounts of the news. I mean, we did a study at Cardiff about 4 or 5 years ago with my colleagues, and 50% and 80% of stories that appeared in the newspapers originated from public relations firms. So, a lot of the stories that you're reading, you know, there isn't really that much investigative journalism going on in the press. This is one of the kind of one of the great ironies of Levinson, whether you agree with press regulation, statutory regulation or not. The newspapers always hold up their hands and say, "Oh well, you don't want to muzzle us," but go and have a look at particularly most of the press. There isn't much investigative reporting. There's very good reasons for this. It's very, very expensive to actually engage in investigative reporting. So a lot of journalism is reproducing press releases, and a lot of journalists don't unfortunately have that much autonomy. If you're a high up journalist at the BBC, and there you might, and you're a name, then you begin to carve out a space for you to have more journalistic autonomy, and maybe have more space to cover the sort of stories. If you're a Robert Peston or somebody like that, then yes, you have much more space. But certainly for the people lower down the food chain, and at places like the BBC, there's also been a great deal of people put on to casualised contracts. People tend to stay in line, unfortunately.
I want to pick up on a word that you used. You used the word unprofessional. Why do you feel that the journalists that wrote those headlines were unprofessional?
You know, I start to be aware that we are still professional, and there are unprofessional who write in this way or tackling the political issues. So if they write in this way, why? What motivates them to write or to cover this?
Well, let me come back to you at that, because you say that there are some journalists who are unprofessional in writing that. Why? I'll repeat the question. Why do you think that writing in the way that they did about that was unprofessional? What makes it unprofessional?
Yes, and sometimes they are not based on evidence. They are not informed journalists. They want to sell, to make the business. So they pick just the words, the most controversial words, and then build the story on these words.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that's a very interesting question, a very interesting debate, and we can talk about this for a long time. But I'll briefly make a couple of brief points about that. When I was working as a journalist in newsrooms, I worked with journalists who subsequently went on to work on the Sun, for 750,000 words in the English language, and a Sun journalist has, you'll know more about this than I do, a Sun journalist has a vocabulary, a regular vocabulary of something like, I think it's 175 words?
I think it was a bit more than that.
Slightly more than that,
Yeah.
but not much. Okay? Now that's quite scary, but that's the way they have to write. And I'll tell you something, if you've ever tried doing it, it's bloody hard to write in a way, to write as a tabloid journalist is really, really hard to get a message across. So the first thing I would say is you need to qualify the word unprofessional, because a lot of these journalists are very, very professional. They are extremely good at what they do. And you might not agree that what they do reflects what you want to hear, but that doesn't mean they're not professional. Okay? But I do agree that in some cases they are ill-informed. But equally, as Mike says, the way they present or portray is often as a result of the audience that they're writing for and the guidelines under which, the editorial guidelines under which they write. Okay? So it may not be unprofessional, it may be ill-informed, and those two things can sit side by side. Okay? I just want to ask, just while we're on this, because it's raised interest, how many of you, I'm going to ask the Muslim community, because of course you're all one, how many of you believe that the BBC is biased against the Muslim community, the Muslim culture? Okay, a couple of 2, 3, 4 of you, okay. I'm going to ask, it's a bit different with the Jewish community, how many of the Jewish community feel that, and I'm going to use a stereotype here, I know I shouldn't do this, how many of the Jewish community feel that the BBC is anti-Zionist, is anti-Israel? I know I'm focusing on a very particular thing. How many Jewish people here believe that okay, that's all right. 3, 2, maybe, possibly, okay. The reason I asked the question, we had a discussion, we had a debate a little while ago between, again, Muslim and Jewish communities here in Bristol. And members of ISOC and members of JSOC came along. And one of the members of JSOC said, of course, we all know that the BBC is anti-Jewish. At which point the Muslim community fell about and said, you have to be joking, don't you? The BBC is anti-Muslim and pro-Israel, conflating the things that we talked about earlier. The reality is that you see, to a degree, you see what you want to see, you hear what you want to hear. And you can read into styles of reporting what you want to read into, positive and negative. Yes, there are some journalists that have political agendas, and I would name Paula Gurr as one of those. But equally, Mike would probably say that research has shown that actually she isn't biased. The way the BBC works with complaints is that if they get complaints about a subject, and they've done research into anti-Semitism, into Islamophobia, and they've measured this. Now, whether you believe what they say is another matter, but they've measured this and claim that generally the balance of complaints pro and against that says the BBC is Islamophobic or isn't, that says it's anti-Semitic or isn't, is about 50-50. It's actually about equal. And the BBC's view is, if it's about equal, we're probably getting it right. Okay? There's lies, damn lies and statistics, but that's how the BBC operates. And to be honest, is that a bad way of operating? I don't know. You do the maths.
I also have one other thing, which is that, part of the reason why journalists produce very, very negative stories about immigrants is because there's a big market for that in Britain. There are deep strains of people who like that kind of coverage. As terrible as that sounds, the Daily Mail wouldn't produce all that kind of coverage if there wasn't a market for it. In most countries, there are sections of the public that are intensely hostile towards people who are different. And this is just true. And, there's a big debate to be had about how much that kind of coverage creates it and how much it responds to it. And that's a very, very difficult thing to unpick. I think there's probably elements of both in there. surrounded by media from the moment almost that they're born nowadays. So you can't kind of say anyone's a media-free zone. They haven't grown up around these kind of stereotypes and around this kind of imagery. I would disagree with Peter on one thing. I think he was slightly conflating, and I think you agreed with that, with the issue around kind of whether things are anti-Muslim or anti-Jewish, and the issue of Israel first. I think we can kind of... Yeah, I think you can ask whose perspectives appear more often in the media, and there are ways of looking at that, and there are ways of even quantifying and talking about that. Who gets interviewed more often, whose perspectives are featured more often. I mean, when we did stuff on, I think, extensive work on the Israel-Palestine conflict, and the thing that was clear was there's almost no context for the conflict, but that doesn't really necessarily separate that out from any of the other reporting of other areas that the BBC does. It tends not to provide very, very much context, and that I think is very, very problematic for trying to report and explain long-standing and historic conflicts which have deep historical roots.
I'm afraid that due to time we've got to actually wrap this up. We started a bit later than we anticipated. So for start, I'd like to thank our speakers for the night. If there's any down, we can still ambush them with questions afterwards. But in terms of tomorrow, the remainder of the BRISOC-JSOC collaboration, at midday, it's going to be a collaboration. We're going together for the Jummah Fair in Activity Room 11 in the Students' Union at 12 o'clock. This will be a combination of prayers, plus refreshments, and a talk on the process. In the evening, so about 6 o'clock till the night, it's going to be a joint Kabbalah Shabbat, so a meal for the end of the week. It will be a delightful experience to meet people and understand a bit more about, over the course of the day, really understand almost the religious aspects, having today's grand social and media and cultural aspects. So once again, if you'd like to ambush them afterwards, there's up here. So, Bill, thank you.
Can I just make a very, very quick announcement in addition to thanking the speakers? My name is Valerie and I'm the interfaith rep of the Jewish communities here in Bristol. And I've worked at Salam Shalom. And I've created a series of podcasts with some Muslim colleagues called Roots of Hatred. So we looked at Islamophobia and anti-Semitism together. Who do I write to get that out to you guys if you'd like to hear them? Number one. Tell me how you can find. Get people on Facebook pages.
Sat right next to